Tonight, we'll be looking back at some of the most haunting disasters ever recorded in human history. Before you settle in and get comfortable, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. But only if you truly enjoy mysterious things. Now, dim the lights and let's begin tonight's journey together. On March 23, 1994, Aeroflot Flight 593 departed Moscow bound for Hong Kong, carrying 75 people on board. Before it could reach its destination, the aircraft began pitching violently, climbing sharply, then nosediving again and again, until, on the final plunge, it struck the ground at low altitude. The Airbus A310 disintegrated on impact, killing everyone aboard. The subsequent investigation revealed that the catastrophe had not been caused by mechanical failure, but rather by a sequence of human errors made inside the cockpit that night. The flight crew consisted of Captain Andrei Viktorovich Danilov, age 40, First Officer Igor Vasilyevich Piskaryov, age 33, and Relief First Officer Yaroslav Vladimirovich Kudrinsky, age 39. Kudrinsky's role was to take over during the long 13-hour journey so that the main crew could rest. Also on board was Aeroflot pilot Vladimir Makarov, traveling as a passenger on company business to Hong Kong. A few hours after a smooth departure, Captain Danilov handed control to Kudrinsky and left the cockpit to rest in the empty business class cabin, planning to return before descent into Hong Kong. He never got that chance. Kudrinsky was an experienced aviator, nearly 9,000 flight hours, with about 1,000 specifically on the Airbus A310 doubles. 2 years with Aeroflot, and not a single recorded incident. That spotless record made what followed all the more perplexing. Among the passengers were Kudrinsky's 2 children, 16-year-old Eldar and 12-year-old Yana. At the time, allowing children to briefly visit the cockpit was not unusual. Hoping to impress his kids, Kudrinsky went further. He invited them to sit in the captain's seat and hold the control yoke. Yana went first. Her father adjusted the seat and let her rest her hands on the controls. The autopilot was engaged, so Kudrinsky subtly tweaked the heading knob to make it seem as though she were really flying the aircraft. No formal handover of control was made. Kudrinsky remained the acting pilot in command. Neither Piskaryov nor the jump-seating Makarov objected. Piskaryov continued responding to radio calls while Makarov chatted casually and even suggested taking photographs of the children. The mood in the cockpit was relaxed and lighthearted. When Yana returned to the jump seat, Eldar took her place. Once again, Kudrinsky allowed his child to grip the yoke, nudging the autopilot slightly so that Eldar could believe he was steering the jet. But unlike his sister, Eldar held the control off-center for more than 30 seconds, enough to trigger a partial disengagement of the autopilot. A small warning light illuminated on the instrument panel, but no one noticed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the aircraft began banking in the direction Eldar was pressing. At about 8:55 p.m., Eldar asked why the plane was tilting. The cockpit voice recorder captured the exchange, initially calm. Kudrinsky admitted he wasn't sure. Makarov speculated that the jet was entering a holding pattern. Piskaryov agreed. Seconds later, the angle of bank increased sharply, and panic erupted. No one in the cockpit immediately understood what was happening. Kudrinsky, standing behind the seats, was thrown against the rear bulkhead by the mounting G-forces, pinned so tightly that he couldn't reach his chair. Piskaryov, struggling against the same force, could barely grab the yoke with one hand. Both men shouted instructions to Eldar, but at 16, completely untrained, he was powerless to respond effectively. The aircraft continued rolling and losing altitude. With the autopilot only partially engaged, the system tried to correct by pulling the nose up and increasing thrust, but that maneuver pushed the jet into an aerodynamic stall. Realizing it could no longer stabilize the flight, the autopilot disconnected entirely. Another safety system automatically kicked in to recover from the stall by sharply pitching the nose downward. The cockpit descended into chaos, shouts, overlapping commands, alarms blaring. Kudrinsky fought the G-forces, clawing his way back into the captain's seat and grasping the controls. Together, he and Piskaryov managed to pull the aircraft out of the dive, but they overcorrected, sending it climbing steeply once again until it stalled a second time and began spiraling toward the earth. Everything happened so quickly that there was no chance to issue a distress call. The desperate voices of the crew, confused, shouting over the blare of warnings, filled the final 2 minutes of the recording. When they finally regained level flight, the aircraft was far too low to recover. The last words captured from the cockpit were those of Kudrinsky. "We'll get out of it. It's all right. Easy. Easy pull." Seconds later, Aeroflot Flight 593 slammed into the side of a mountain in the Russian wilderness, killing all 75 souls on board. The investigation that followed reached an almost unanimous conclusion. The crash had been caused by allowing children to interfere with the aircraft's flight controls. Certain design aspects of the Airbus A310 also came under criticism, particularly the absence of a clear audible alert when the autopilot partially disengaged. Regulators and airlines around the world soon mandated improved pilot training for autopilot-related incidents, but ultimate responsibility rested with the flight crew. The tragedy became a sobering reminder of the immense gravity of command. If any pilot had ever doubted the danger of letting a child touch the controls of a passenger jet, the fate of Flight 593 erased that illusion forever. One heartbreaking analysis concluded that if the pilots had simply released the controls and done nothing, the aircraft's automated systems would have restabilized, and the crash would never have occurred. Those final minutes, marked by confusion, panic, and futile struggle against a disaster of their own making, sealed the flight's tragic destiny. Today, in the post-9 divided by 11 world, airlines strictly enforce a sterile cockpit rule, prohibiting any distraction or unauthorized presence. The era when children could visit the cockpit, even for a glimpse, is long gone. And it is hoped that after learning the story of Flight 593, no captain will ever again try to impress his family at the cost of so many lives. On May 25, 1950, at approximately 6:30 in the evening, a crowded streetcar rumbled through the busy streets of Chicago. As it approached a track junction, the motorman failed to notice the frantic hand signals of a city worker standing ahead. Moments later, the streetcar thundered straight through the switch at full speed, collided head-on with a gasoline tanker. Fuel erupted into flames, transforming the intersection into a towering fireball and igniting one of the deadliest public transit disasters in Chicago's history. By 1950, electric streetcars were still a common sight in the city. Chicago had recently purchased hundreds of new electric cars painted in a distinctive green and cream color scheme, earning them the nickname Green Hornets. Each car could seat about 57 passengers, with many more standing during rush hour. Every Green Hornet was operated by 2 employees of the Chicago Transit Authority, MIT, one motorman responsible for driving, and one conductor stationed near the rear door to collect fares and assist passengers. Riders boarded through the wide rear entrance, found a seat, and exited through the 2 narrower front doors at their stop. Although the cars ran on fixed rails, their routes could shift depending on traffic or construction. Switches along the track allowed drivers to divert between lines or turn back at loop junctions scattered across the network. On that particular day, however, the reroute had been caused by flooding. A viaduct near the intersection of State Street and 63rd had filled with water. Because the traction motors of most streetcars sat low beneath the chassis, even shallow water could disable them. City workers were dispatched to pump out the tunnel, a job that took several hours. In the meantime, all streetcars were redirected. A trackman named Charles Klein was assigned to manage the detour. His task was to stand beside the junction, signal each car to slow down, and manually throw the switch so the vehicles could loop back. For hours he worked steadily, flagging down streetcars and guiding them through the turn. By the time the floodwaters began to recede, he had rerouted nearly 200 trips. At last, Klein was told that in 15 minutes, service would return to normal. Relieved, he returned to his post to handle the last few runs of the day. Around 6:30, another Green Hornet approached. He waved for the car to slow down, but it didn't. Surprised, he stepped forward, waving more urgently. The streetcar kept coming. Despite his desperate attempts, the vehicle roared past him at full throttle. Seconds later, it entered the loop at a dangerously high speed. Survivors later recalled hearing the distinctive humming sound of the emergency brake being engaged, proof that the motorman had realized his mistake, but it was far too late. The Green Hornet slammed into a gasoline truck emerging from the viaduct. The resulting explosion shook the neighborhood. A fireball tore through the front of the streetcar, shattering windows and instantly engulfing the interior in flames. Fuel gushed from the ruptured tanker, spreading across the pavement and encircling the wreck in a burning pool. Within seconds, the entire scene became an inferno. Inside the car, panic erupted. Passengers surged toward the rear, desperately seeking an escape from the fire. Among them was 14-year-old Beverly Clark, traveling alone on her way to the movies. Thrown to the floor by the impact and trampled by terrified riders, Beverly somehow managed to stand and reach the center doors, only to find them locked. She shoved and kicked to no avail, until she remembered something: a small emergency release latch near the door. She knew its location because she and her friends had once played with it, pulling it during past rides. Those childish experiments now saved her life. Beverly yanked the handle, the door popped open, and she jumped to the street. A handful of other passengers followed her out before the fire consumed the doorway completely. At the rear of the car, others were not so fortunate. The exit there opened inward, making it impossible to push against the crush of bodies. William Liddell, the conductor, had been thrown from his seat during the collision and briefly trampled. Regaining his footing, he saw passengers piled against the door, shouting for help. Liddell ordered them to step back, knowing the mechanism couldn't unlatch under pressure. Through smoke and screams, he pulled the lever, and miraculously, the door sprang open. He and several others escaped before the crowd once again pressed forward, forcing it shut. Inside, smoke filled the compartment. Some tried to break windows, but many panes were reinforced with steel safety bars meant to prevent passengers from leaning out. A grim irony, as the safety bars had now become prison bars. A few managed to squeeze through gaps. 18-year-old Arlene Franzen later described wriggling painfully through a narrow opening, collapsing onto the grass outside. When she looked back, she saw a co-worker, who had happened to board the same car, trying to climb out of the same window. In an instant, flames engulfed him, and he fell backward into the burning coach. Bystanders rushed forward but were driven back by the heat. By the time firefighters arrived, the blaze was so intense that the first responders didn't even realize a streetcar was at its center. In total, 34 people, including the motorman, were killed, and 50 others were badly injured. The flames spread to nearby buildings, leaving more than 100 residents homeless. It remains the deadliest and most destructive collision in history involving just two vehicles. The investigation that followed pointed to several contributing factors. Questions were raised about the performance of Charles Climb, the switchman on duty. He had not been wearing full uniform and lacked the required flag or flare. He had also engaged in an unsafe but common practice known as plugging the switch, wedging it open so it would stay aligned in one direction. But the blame did not rest solely with him. The Green Hornet's design also came under fire. Inward opening doors, barred windows, a single side exit, and a lack of accessible emergency releases made escape nearly impossible. Investigators also found that no strict speed limits were enforced for streetcars, and the motorman himself had been involved in roughly 10 previous minor collisions without any requalification checks. Finally, city officials examined the regulations governing gasoline transport through Chicago's downtown. Whereas many cities restricted such shipments to nighttime hours or small volumes, Chicago had virtually no limits in place. Following the crash, those policies were overhauled. Speed limits were imposed on streetcars. Emergency door releases were installed at every exit. Window bars were removed or replaced with detachable frames. Switchmen were required to wear high-visibility uniforms, and drivers faced periodic medical and performance evaluations. Even so, those improvements came too late to save the victims, and perhaps too late to save the streetcars themselves. In the years after the tragedy, the Green Hornet fleet gradually disappeared from Chicago's streets, replaced by cheaper gasoline-powered buses. By 1955, nearly all had been retired, and as the Green Hornet vanished, so too did the memory of that horrific night. Today, the Green Hornet streetcar crash survives only as a faint echo, a tragic footnote in the long and complicated history of Chicago. On June 28, 1975, just off the shores of Amity Island, a young woman was brutally killed in what would later be remembered as one of the most infamous shark attacks in American history. At first, it was assumed to be an isolated incident, an unfortunate accident in otherwise calm waters. But the days that followed proved it was only the beginning of a horrifying chain of events caused by a massive great white shark, one that seemed to have developed a disturbing preference for hunting human prey. The story of that summer of terror why, and the bizarre way it all came to an end, has since passed into local legend, becoming a defining chapter in the history of Amity Island. Situated off the New England coast, Amity had long been a beloved seaside destination known for its endless beaches, salt air, and crystal-clear waters. Every summer, thousands of tourists flooded the little town to sail, surf, and swim beneath the July Sunday. The first attack took place at night, unseen by witnesses. The victim, Chrissy Watkins, was a young vacationer who had gone for a late swim off the island's southern beach. Though she had arrived with her boyfriend, he was too intoxicated to join her and quickly passed out on the sand. When he woke the next morning, she was gone. Her remains were found washed ashore, and the coroner determined she had been killed by a shark, but that fact was not immediately made public. As later revealed, the town's mayor had pressured officials to alter the death certificate, AI, changing the cause from shark attack to boating accident. The motive was simple: money. Amity's economy lived and died by its beaches, and any mention of a shark could destroy the entire summer season. So the beaches stayed open, and swimmers unknowingly shared the water with a predator. Days later, in broad daylight, with the ocean packed with tourists, the shark struck again. This time, the victim was young Alex Kintner, pulled beneath the surface and killed in front of horrified onlookers. The town erupted in panic. At the emergency meeting that followed, angry residents demanded answers, but the mayor, desperate to preserve tourism revenue, agreed to close the beaches for just one day. He insisted that shark attacks were rare and there was no reason for hysteria. Still, rumors of a man-eating shark spread fast, inflamed by the $3,000 bounty posted by the Kintner family. Fishermen from all over descended on Amity Bay, scouring the waters for the beast. Within days, a group claimed success, hauling in a medium-sized tiger shark that was immediately displayed at the dock like a trophy, a supposed guarantee that the danger had passed. Despite the objections of Police Chief Martin Brody, who argued that the captured shark was far too small to be responsible for the attacks, the mayor declared the beaches safe. Tourists returned in droves, and in the mayor's eyes, the crisis was over. But on July 4th, the island's busiest holiday, the illusion shattered. As crowds packed the shore for Independence Day celebrations, the great white struck again, killing a local sailing instructor in front of hundreds of witnesses. The idyllic image of Amity collapsed into chaos. From that moment, everything changed. Chief Brody joined forces with a grizzled local fisherman who claimed to specialize in hunting man-eaters, and a visiting marine biologist eager to study the predator. Together, the unlikely trio set sail with one mission: to find and kill the monster haunting their shores. To many locals, the expedition sounded like a fool's errand, no different from a tall tale told in a seaside bar. Yet just 3 days later, Brody and the marine biologist returned, sunburned, battered, and clinging to a makeshift raft. Their story was as unbelievable as it was terrifying. The shark was dead. According to their account, the creature had attacked and sunk their boat, killing the fishermen, before Brody finally destroyed it by lodging a compressed air tank in its mouth and firing his rifle at it, causing the tank to explode. It sounded like something straight out of Hollywood, a shark attacking a boat and dying in a cinematic blast, but the physical evidence salvaged from the wreck supported their story. More importantly, the attacks stopped. Tourists slowly returned to the beaches, and within weeks, life on Amity Island resumed its normal rhythm. Over time, the terror of that summer faded, replaced by new memories of sunshine, laughter, and crowded boardwalks. Though the events of 1975 remain a dark and sensational chapter in Amity's past, few of today's vacationers have any idea of the blood that once stained its waters, or of the enormous white predator that, for one fateful summer, turned paradise into a place of fear. On December 3, 1979, the British rock band The Who was scheduled to perform at the Riverfront Coliseum in Cincinnati, Ohio. Thousands of ticket holders had gathered outside the venue for hours, waiting anxiously to enter, but the promoters kept the crowd sealed out while last-minute preparations continued inside. When the signal to open the gates finally came, only 2 doors were unlocked, for more than 8,000 fans. By the time The Who took the stage that evening, 11 concert-goers were already dead. At the time of the tragedy, The Who were in the midst of the American leg of their world tour, and tickets were among the most coveted in rock music. 18,348 seats were available at the Riverfront Coliseum, and every last one sold out in under 2 hours. Like many major concerts of the era, the event used a festival seating system, meaning general admission. Whoever arrived first could claim the best spots near the stage. The setup encouraged fans to line up early, but it also came with serious risks. Without assigned seats, spectators often crowded into aisles or blocked exits for a better view. Minor scuffles were common when doors opened, as fans surged forward to secure prime positions. On December 3rd, those same behaviors would turn deadly. A local radio station had announced that entry would begin at 3 o'clock that afternoon. Many fans arrived by 1, gathering in the parking lots outside the arena, smoking, drinking, and talking as they waited. But the doors never opened. As hours passed, the crowd grew larger and more restless. By mid-afternoon, police had been called to monitor the swelling numbers. Witnesses estimated several thousand people were pressed together outside, with more still arriving. The doors stayed shut. As daylight faded, the crowd inched closer to the entrance, bracing for the first glimpse of an opening gate. By 7 o'clock, 4 hours after many had expected to be let in, patience gave way to frustration. Small surges began near the doors. Those trapped at the front found themselves pinned against the glass, unable to move, while pressure from behind continued to build. Inside, the promoters were still unprepared. Ticket staff were short-handed, and the band was finishing its final soundcheck. That soundcheck would prove fatal. From outside, the low rumble of amplifiers and drums led many to believe the concert had already begun. The crowd surged. Almost simultaneously, 2 doors on the right-hand side of the main entrance swung open. The result was a slow, crushing wave of human force. Arena staff struggled to hold back the crowd while still attempting to collect tickets. It wasn't the chaotic trampling some later imagined. It was worse. A sustained, suffocating pressure that lasted nearly 30 minutes. Eyewitnesses described people lifted off their feet, pressed so tightly together they could no longer breathe. Survivors later said they realized, in horror, that they were stepping on other bodies but were themselves trapped, able only to shout into the roar, begging those behind to stop pushing. One man remembered being locked upright, surrounded by strangers with their heads tilted back and mouths open, gasping for air. The heat from thousands of bodies created a dense mist above the crowd. Police officers stood nearby but did not intervene, believing the fans were simply intoxicated and unruly. Some who escaped the crush ran to plead for help, only to be yelled at, told not to tell the officers how to do their jobs. No assistance came. Inside the Coliseum, staff didn't realize the extent of the catastrophe until most of the audience had already entered. Several victims had died within minutes of the surge, their bodies held upright by the weight of the crowd. Only after the pressure eased did rescuers discover the dead and injured, alongside piles of shoes, wallets, clothing, and personal items ripped away in the struggle. Thousands of bloody footprints covered the floor. Some attendees would later find dried blood on their shoes and not know why. The management of Riverfront Coliseum met in haste and made a fateful decision. The show would go on. They feared that canceling could trigger another deadly rush as 18,000 fans flooded back outside. By the time The Who took the stage, the victims' bodies had been removed, and the seriously injured rushed to local hospitals. 11 people had lost their lives. Walter Adams Jr., 22. Peter Bowes, 18. Connie Sue Burns, 21. Jacqueline Eckerle. David Heck, 19. Tiva Rai Ladd, 27. 27. Karen Morrison, 15. Stephen Preston, 19. Philip Snyder, 20. Ryan Wagner, 17. James Warmoth, 21. The band themselves knew nothing of the disaster until after the encore. When informed, they were devastated. In the following days, The Who considered canceling the remainder of the tour but ultimately chose to continue, dedicating the next performance to those who had died. Pete Townshend told the crowd, "We lost a lot of family last night. This show is for them." Even decades later, surviving band members remained haunted by the tragedy. Public reaction at the time was uneven. Some commentators coldly blamed the victims, dismissing the incident as the fault of drunken, drugged-up kids. Newspapers ran sensational headlines describing a stampede, a portrayal strongly rejected by witnesses who had experienced a slow, crushing suffocation, not a riot. Investigators soon determined that the festival seating policy was a major contributing factor, and that warning signs had been ignored. Previous concerts at the same venue had seen smaller surges, and the Riverfront Coliseum had already faced criticism for overselling tickets, fire code violations, and its refusal to coordinate with police during emergencies. Management denied responsibility, claiming the exterior area was city property and therefore outside their control. City officials and fire chiefs condemned the general admission model, warning that the problem worsened each year as fans began arriving earlier and earlier. The Coliseum's management brushed off those concerns, insisting audiences preferred the format. In the end, the tragedy forced sweeping change. Cincinnati and several other cities banned festival seating altogether, imposing strict limits on crowd density and ensuring every concertgoer had a designated space. The Who disaster was a turning point, leading to nationwide reforms in venue safety. The Riverfront Coliseum eventually improved its safety record and was later renamed Heritage Bank Center. More than 35 years after the tragedy, a memorial plaque was installed outside the arena, engraved with the victims' names and a brief remembrance. 11 fans lost their lives in the southwest entryway of Riverfront Coliseum while awaiting The Who on December 3, 1979. Many others were injured in what remains one of the deadliest concert disasters in American history. This tragedy led to new crowd safety laws adopted around the world. On September 5, 2020, at approximately 10:20 in the morning, an extended family gathered at the edge of El Dorado Ranch Park in Yucaipa, California. They had come together for what was meant to be a joyful occasion, a gender reveal party, a modern celebration where expectant parents unveil the sex of their unborn child in some creative or dramatic fashion. But the method this family chose to make their announcement would ignite one of the most devastating wildfires in California's recent history, a disaster that burned for weeks, destroyed homes, and claimed a life. It was only one of many tragedies born from increasingly reckless attempts to turn private milestones into public spectacles. The very first gender reveal, ironically, was a wholesome and harmless affair. Blogger and journalist Jenna Karvounidis hosted a small family gathering in 2008, baking a homemade cake that appeared ordinary on the outside but revealed pink icing inside, signifying that she was expecting a girl. Her simple idea spread quickly online, inspiring thousands of imitators. By the early 2010s, the practice had evolved from cutting cakes to staging elaborate stunts. Parents-to-be sought ever bigger ways to surprise their friends and followers. Boxes of colored balloons, confetti cannons, smoke bombs, fireworks, burnout tires spewing pink or blue clouds, even explosives filled with colored powder. The more dramatic the reveal, the greater the applause, and the more viral the video. It didn't take long before this became a kind of social media arms race. Each year brought a new round of attention-seeking displays, pushing the boundaries of what people were willing to do for a few seconds of online fame. Ironically, the very news coverage criticizing the trend only seemed to make it more popular. That competitive impulse set the stage for one of the first true disasters. On April 23, 2017, a Border Patrol agent named Dennis Dickey wanted something spectacular, so he packed a metal container with tannerite, a powerful explosive compound that detonates when struck by a bullet, and mixed in colored powder to create a dramatic plume of blue smoke. Dickey and his relatives gathered near the Santa Rita Mountains in Arizona to pull off the stunt, despite a fire weather warning issued by the National Weather Service that day. Such warnings mean that conditions, dry vegetation, low humidity, and high winds could cause fires to spread uncontrollably. When Dickey fired his rifle, the explosion worked as planned. A blue cloud erupted into the air. But within seconds, the surrounding grass caught fire. Flames raced across the dry terrain faster than anyone could react. To his credit, Dickey immediately called emergency services and did not attempt to cover up his mistake. Firefighters arrived quickly but could not contain the blaze. The resulting sawmill fire scorched more than 73 square miles of state and national forest land, CA, about 190 square kilometers, and took 2 weeks to extinguish. The firefighting effort cost $8 million and forced 200 people to evacuate. Miraculously, no one was killed, but the damage was immense. Dickey later pleaded guilty, receiving 5 years of probation and an order to pay restitution for 20 years, monthly payments that will continue until long after the child he was celebrating reaches adulthood. 2 years later, on September 7, 2019, another gender reveal stunt nearly ended in tragedy. A Texas couple near the town of Turkey hired a small crop-dusting plane to dump 350 gallons of pink water over a field. Moments after releasing the liquid, the aircraft lost speed, stalled, and crashed nose first into the ground. One passenger was injured, though both survived. The plane, however, was destroyed. Just a month later, on October 26, 2019, tragedy struck again, this time in Knoxville, Iowa. Members of the Kremeyer family decided to announce their baby's gender with a homemade explosion. After experimenting with various mixtures, they settled on a combination of gunpowder and colored baby powder, packed inside a welded metal pipe. To direct the blast upward, they sealed the top with tape, inadvertently turning the device into a true pipe bomb. When it detonated, shards of metal shot outward in every direction. One fragment struck Pamela Kremeyer, age 56, the expectant child's grandmother, killing her instantly. Incidents like these, though horrific, only fueled more fascination with the phenomenon. Social media algorithms rewarded the outrageous. News outlets amplified the spectacle. And so, by September 5, 2020, the stage was set for the deadliest gender reveal in history. That morning in Yucaipa, a family placed a smoke bomb at the edge of El Dorado Ranch Park, Key West, an area flanked by dry hillsides, grasslands, and suburban neighborhoods. Surveillance footage later showed adults and children gathered around as the device was ignited. Within seconds, flames spread through the brittle brush. They tried to douse the fire with water bottles and dirt, but it was hopeless. By the time firefighters arrived, the blaze had already jumped across fields and into the foothills. The inferno raced toward nearby homes, driven by wind and drought conditions. Hundreds of residents were forced to flee. Crews battled the flames day and night for more than a month. The El Dorado fire was not declared fully contained until October 10th, and not completely extinguished until November 16th, over 6 weeks later. In total, nearly 23,000 acres burned. 10 structures, including 4 homes, were destroyed. Dozens were injured, thousands displaced, and one firefighter, Charles Edward Morton, age 39, lost his life in the line of duty. Morton, a respected member of the U.S. Forest Service, was remembered by his colleagues as a selfless, devoted firefighter, a man who gave everything to protect others. His death became the somber symbol of how far this cultural obsession had gone. Legal proceedings for the family responsible were still pending as of 2025, with damages continuing to be assessed. The El Dorado fire remains the most catastrophic gender reveal event ever recorded, yet, with social media still rewarding excess and spectacle, experts fear it may not be the last. There is, however, a final coda to this story. Jenna Karvounidis, the woman who started the trend over a decade earlier, publicly expressed her regret, not only because of the fires and deaths, but because of what the practice had come to represent. She now believes that an unborn child's gender is far less important than the person they will grow up to be. The daughter whose pink cake once went viral has since grown into a young adult who doesn't care much for traditional gender roles at all. Today, Karvounidis encourages expectant parents to celebrate something simpler, perhaps choosing a name, or just gathering loved ones for a quiet meal. And if they still feel the need to mark the occasion with color, she suggests going back to the original idea: a homemade cake, a small gathering, and a moment of joy shared safely among family and friends. Because as history has shown, sometimes the sweetest reveal is the one that doesn't explode. On July 5, 2009, at the Walt Disney World Resort in Florida, 2 monorail trains collided, killing a cast member. The fatal crash did not happen on a roller coaster or a thrill ride, but on the resort's iconic single-beam monorail, a system designed simply to shuttle guests around and between the parks. Disney's monorail debuted in 1971 and was expanded several times through the 1970s and 1980s. By the end of 1988, it comprised 3 loops, serving 6 stations, a configuration that remains in place today. 2 of the loops serve the Magic Kingdom. One is the express line linking the transportation and ticket center directly to the park, and the other is the resort line, which stops at the hotels around Seven Seas Lagoon. The 3rd loop, entirely separate, serves Epcot. Guests transferring between Epcot and the Magic Kingdom lines must change trains at the transportation and ticket center. Operationally, however, Disney routinely repositions trains between loops via a series of switch tracks and connecting spurs, a coordinated process involving multiple roles. Each monorail is driven by a pilot. Overseeing the system is a central control supervisor, who directs pilots, and a console operator, who powers sections of track on or off and throws the switches. All parties communicate continuously by radio. The accident occurred at 2 o'clock in the morning on July 5, 2009. Although most areas of the resort were closed by then, the monorail was still running to return guests to their hotels. 3 trains were active on the Epcot loop: Monorail Pink, Monorail Purple, and Monorail Coral. Pink was due to go out of service and head to maintenance. To reach the maintenance facility, Pink needed to transfer from the Epcot loop to the Magic Kingdom Express line. Initially, the move went according to plan. The train rolled onto the connecting spur and stopped, then reported in to Central Control. The supervisor radioed the console operator to set the switches for Pink to reverse onto the connector. Here's where the failure chain began. The console operator powered down the Epcot beam in preparation for the switch throw, but was then distracted by 2 nearly simultaneous radio calls concerning other trains. After handling those calls, he re-energized the Epcot beam, mistakenly believing he had already thrown the switch. He had not. Reporting back that the route was lined, he received confirmation from the supervisor for Pink to reverse. The pilot of Pink began backing up. Because the switches had not been moved, Pink did not enter the connector. It reversed straight back onto the active Epcot main line. At that moment, Monorail Purple was approaching in the opposite direction on the same beam, carrying a pilot and 6 passengers. With only seconds to react, Purple's pilot threw his train into reverse, an instinctive final act to shield his riders. At precisely 2 o'clock, the trains collided near the Transportation and Ticket Center. The rear cab of Pink and the lead cab of Purple were crushed, trapping Purple's pilot. Despite desperate efforts by guests and employees, he did not survive. The victim was Austin Wewenenberg, 21 Resalis, remembered by friends and family as a brilliant, beloved young man. In the days that followed, co-workers and hundreds of guests who had met him at Walt Disney World shared tributes in his honor. Disney quickly determined there was no underlying mechanical flaw in the monorail vehicles themselves. Service resumed the next day even as the investigation continued. The National Transportation Safety Board later concluded that multiple layers of protection could have, and should have, prevented the crash. Like many attractions, the monorail uses an automatic train protection system designed to prevent 2 trains from occupying the same block of track. But that safeguard is often disabled during reverse moves for switching, which meant it could not intervene here. The NTSB also found that the supervisor might have recognized the failed switch alignment had he been physically present in the control room. He had stepped away, reportedly to a nearby concession, and was managing movements solely by radio. Could Pink's pilot have noticed the wrong route? In theory, yes, but in practice, the beams looked nearly identical. The cab windows were fogged, and ambient lighting was poor. Investigators concluded the pilot would have had little chance of visually detecting the misrouting. Procedurally, the operating manual required that before reversing, the pilot relocate from the forward cab to the rear cab to obtain proper visibility. In reality, supervisors seldom enforced or reminded pilots of this step, and on the night in question it was not followed. Finally, the console operator had access to CCTV cameras covering the switch area, tools that could have revealed the misaligned route. By habit, however, those cameras were checked only before a switch throw to ensure the path was clear, not after to verify the alignment had actually changed. At each stage, there was a chance to break the chain. At each stage, that chance was missed. In the aftermath, Disney enacted sweeping changes. Any monorail performing a reverse move must now have a spotter stationed in the rear cab. All transportation cast received supplemental training. Defogging window heaters were installed. Additional live cameras now monitor switch zones, and every switch throw requires a second operator's confirmation before a pilot is authorized to move. As a precaution, guest access to the front cab, Kong, once a cherished perk, was discontinued. Together with other improvements, these measures made the Walt Disney World monorail safer than ever. Notably, only a small portion of the 2 trains was destroyed in the collision. The undamaged sections were reconfigured into Monorail Teal and Monorail Peach, both of which remain in service today. Since July 5, 2009, The system has carried nearly 150,000 riders each year without another fatality. It is the only deadly accident in the history of Disney's monorail. Compared with the resort's headline attractions, the monorail may seem simple. No steep drops, no special effects, moderate speeds, predictable routes. But that simplicity can be deceptive. Even the most unassuming train is a complex web of procedures and interlocks. And as this tragedy proved, those systems must be managed with the same rigor as any thrill ride. On December 6, 1917, two ships collided at the mouth of Halifax Harbor in Nova Scotia, Canada. The crash ignited a fire aboard one of them, an aging French cargo vessel loaded with explosives bound for the battlefields of Europe. Exactly 35 seconds after 9:04 a.m., the ship erupted, unleashing one of the largest non-nuclear explosions ever recorded. Halifax Harbor, a vast natural inlet on Canada's Atlantic coast, consists of a broad inner basin called Bedford Basin and a narrow channel known as the Narrows, which connects to the open sea. On one side lay the city of Halifax, on the other, Dartmouth. In 1917, the two communities had a combined population of roughly 65,000, their numbers swelled by wartime activity. The port had become a vital convoy staging point for ships crossing the Atlantic, busier than ever before. Days before the tragedy, the Norwegian relief ship SS Imo had anchored in Bedford Basin to take on supplies. Its departure, scheduled for December 5th, was delayed until after dark, MDA, too late to pass through the harbor's submarine nets, which were raised each night to protect against German U-boats. The crew would have to wait until morning. Meanwhile, the French freighter SS Mont Blanc arrived offshore too late to enter. Her cargo was deadly: TNT, picric acid, gun cotton, and barrels of benzol, a tar-like flammable liquid. She anchored outside the harbor for the night, unaware that by morning she would become the center of catastrophe. At 7:30 a.m., the submarine nets were lowered, and both ships began to move, Imo outward, Mont Blanc inward. Standard navigation rules required ships to keep to the right side of the channel and maintain a speed of no more than 5 knots, about a brisk walking pace. But Imo's captain, anxious to get underway, was traveling faster. First, he encountered the American ship SS Clara, which was already sailing on the wrong side. Forced to swing toward mid-channel to avoid a collision, Imo soon met another vessel, the tug Stella Maris, coming directly down the center. To avoid it, Imo veered even farther across the channel, straight into Mont Blanc's path. The two ships sighted each other at a distance of nearly 3/4 of a mile and exchanged frantic signals. Mont Blanc had the right of way, but Imo refused to yield. As the danger became unavoidable, both vessels cut their engines. Mont Blanc tried to steer clear, but at the last moment Imo's reverse thrust swung her bow sideways, slicing into Mont Blanc's hull. The impact wasn't hard enough to sink either ship, but ruptured the benzol barrels, spilling fuel across the deck and water. As the ships drifted apart, friction between metal surfaces produced sparks. Moments later, Mont Blanc's deck burst into flames. Realizing the imminent danger, Captain Aimé Lemedec ordered his crew to abandon ship. They rowed frantically toward shore, shouting warnings that went largely unheard amid the confusion. The burning Mont Blanc drifted toward Halifax, grounding near Pier 6. A thick column of black smoke rose skyward. Curious onlookers crowded windows and waterfronts for a better view. At 9:04 and 35 seconds, the ship exploded. The blast vaporized the Mont Blanc and leveled nearly everything within a mile and a half. Thousands of homes were flattened. Shards of glass became shrapnel. A gun from the Mont Blanc was hurled 3.5 miles inland. The shockwave traveled faster than sound, shaking all of Nova Scotia. Trees were stripped bare. Rail cars flipped like toys. Ships were tossed from the harbor onto dry land. An estimated 1,600 people died instantly. Thousands more were maimed or blinded by shattered glass. Moments later, a 6-story high tsunami surged into the harbor, sweeping away entire streets and drowning scores of survivors. Imo was capsized and nearly her entire crew lost. Fires ignited throughout the wreckage. Boilers exploded. Homes and factories collapsed. At first, many believed the city was under German attack, and soldiers rushed to man defenses instead of aiding the injured. Only hours later did rescuers realize the true cause. The rescue effort was monumental. Firefighters, police, military personnel, and volunteers clawed through debris searching for survivors. Hospitals overflowed. Nearby naval ships were converted into floating clinics. Even children were seen running errands and delivering messages for rescuers. The next morning, as the city reeled, a blizzard struck. Temperatures plummeted below freezing, and nearly 4 feet of snow buried the ruins. Relief trains carrying supplies were stranded en route by whiteout conditions. It was a disaster compounded upon disaster. Exact fatalities were impossible to determine, but roughly 2,000 were killed and 9,000 injured. Once order was restored, a public inquiry began to assign blame. On the surface, it seemed clear. Emo had been speeding on the wrong side and had ignored right-of-way signals. Yet the presiding judge, Arthur Drysdale, ruled that Mont Blanc's crew bore responsibility, accusing them of violating harbor navigation rules. Many saw the verdict as a reflection of public anger, especially since most of Emo's crew had perished, leaving the surviving French sailors as visible scapegoats. 3 men were charged with manslaughter: Captain Lamed, harbor pilot Francis Mackey, and Frederick Evans Wyatt, the chief examiner of Halifax Port. None were convicted. In 1919, Canada's Supreme Court overturned the earlier ruling, concluding that both vessels shared fault for the tragedy. Out of the ashes, reform emerged. New regulations governed harbor traffic and the handling of hazardous cargo. The scale of the disaster also spurred the growth of charitable organizations. The unprecedented number of eye injuries from flying glass led directly to the founding of the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, and the Red Cross, whose role in Halifax proved indispensable, expanded into a global humanitarian power. The urgent need for housing gave rise to Hydrostone, one of Canada's first planned public housing projects, parts of which still stand today. Among the most enduring legacies was an act of kindness. The city of Boston was among the first to send relief, its trains arriving just as the blizzard struck. Their aid saved countless lives and lifted spirits in Halifax's darkest hour. In gratitude, the people of Nova Scotia sent Boston a Christmas tree that winter, a tradition continued every year since. Though the explosion of December 6, 1917, annihilated Halifax, the city rebuilt stronger. Today, with over 400,000 residents, it remains a thriving port whose skyline hides little trace of the horror once unleashed there. Yet the memory endures, a solemn testament to loss, resilience, and the courage of those who faced the unthinkable. And within that tragedy lies one story of quiet heroism. Patrick Vincent "Vince" Coleman, a telegraph operator for the Canadian Government Railways, was stationed at Richmond Station, near Pier 6, on the morning of the fire. When warned by a frantic sailor that the Mont Blanc would soon explode, Coleman began to flee with his co-worker, but halfway out, he stopped, turned back, and sprinted to his telegraph key. From his post, he tapped out one final message, a desperate warning. "Hold up the train. Ammunition ship on fire and heading for Pier 6 will explode. This will probably be my last message. Goodbye, boys. Think you's not fast." His signal was meant for the overnight express from St. John, New Brunswick, carrying roughly 300 passengers, ISP, a train that would have passed directly beside the burning ship. Because of Coleman's message, it was stopped in time, and all 300 aboard were spared. His warning was relayed across the telegraph network, halting freight and passenger trains throughout Nova Scotia and alerting nearby communities to prepare for disaster. When Mont Blanc finally detonated, Coleman was killed instantly. The blast ripped the hands off his pocket watch, freezing its face at the exact moment of the explosion. Today, that damaged watch, along with his telegraph key, rests in the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic, where visitors still pause to read his story. More than a century later, Vince Coleman is remembered as the man who gave his life to save hundreds of strangers, a quiet hero whose courage shone through one of history's darkest mornings. And that is the story for today. Thank you for watching until the very end. If you enjoy videos like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel so that you receive a notification each time we release a new one. Each time we release a new one. Each time we release a new one. Each time we release a new one.